Simon Gaunt is a medievalist, his specialist research interests are in Old French literature, medieval Occitan literature, textual criticism, and modern critical theory. He's worked on a range of 12th and 13th century texts, including troubadour lyric, chansons de geste. His most recent books are Marco Polo's Le Devisement du Monde, Narrative Voice, Language and Diversity, as well as The Song of Roland and other poems of Charlemagne, which came out with OUP in 2016. And today, so he was a PI on the IHR-funded project Medieval Francophone Literary Culture Outside France, and today he's going to be taking us through his new project, which this time is an ERC-funded project, and with the values of French language and literature in the European Middle Ages.
Thank you very much. This isn't a paper, this really is a description of a very big collaborative project, and you've got here the names of the people who form part of the team, one of whom, Simone Ventura, is here, and if you have questions I might pass some of them in his direction. Funded research is increasingly important to us, and it is very apparent if you look at the statistics for the ERC, which we may or may not have access to in the future. But whereas the humanities generally get a lot of money out of the ERC, our disciplines do not. So I think it is very important, which is to say literary disciplines, modern languages. So I think it's very important that we think about how to access this money. And there are two issues here. One is that we don't allow our research agenda to be led by the social science, the science discourse that shapes the way in which you have to make an application. And conversely, that we actually make sure that it's our research agenda that gets funded by bodies like the ERC. And this project, of which I am the PI, every application has to start out with sound bites. Here are two of our sound bites. What's the relation historically between language and identity in Europe? How have things actually demarcated from each other? And just to comment very briefly on these two research questions, I've worked in a French department, or French departments for 30 years, and heard people talk a lot about language, nation and identity, but almost always by listening to people who are making really vast generalizations about the past. And I just wanted to do a project that was going to look at this question historically. And the second question is a question that really is fundamental and intrinsic, or ought to be fundamental and intrinsic to all of our research in Romance languages. But hardly anyone ever asks it. How is French different from Italian? How is Italian different from Spanish? What are the borders between these languages? And there's almost no dialogue between literary scholarship, philology and linguistics on these points. And part of what this project is designed to do is to create that dialogue. The point about taking Old French in terms of the pitch for the project was very much to offer Old French as a case study for questions that could then be applied to other languages. And there are quite a lot of text on these slides. I'm not going to read them out. I'm going to assume that you can all read while I'm speaking. But part of the point about these initial points is that they're also true of modern English, but a lot of the work that is done on modern English as a world language is assuming that this is a new phenomena, or if you compare it to other phenomena, you can compare it to modern Mandarin, but there are historical other languages, current world languages, but there are historical precedents, and we can learn from looking at these historical precedents. And in terms of cultural history, these last points are extremely dear to me because it's a mantra among medievalists that we always have to work with the absolute divide between Latin and the vernacular. But if you look at the way in which Old French works in many parts of Europe, including in Britain, it's very often functionally working in the same way as Latin, which is to say it's working as an international language and as a learned language. So that's another very important part of our inquiry. I won't read through these. This is lifted straight out of the proposal in terms of what our main objectives are. But the key point here in relation to an ERC project is that their absolute mantra when it comes to evaluating proposals is that research has to be high risk, high gain. And when you get the evaluations, that's clearly one of the most important things. And so what I tried to do in order to address that was to design a project that had an empirical core that was going to deliver come what may, that would then form the basis of a series of much more speculative questions, which were actually more than likely, because this is the humanities, to fall flat on their face. But even if they did fall flat on their face, there would be a core result. And the core result would be this series of editions of this text called the Histoire ancienne jusqu'à César, which I will come back to in a little bit more detail. And the project is basically designed with 4 scenes, which you see here, which work incrementally in relation to each other. So there is a postdoc attached to each of the scenes, production of the editions, a linguistic study of Old French, a study of the relationship between history and literature, which will become clearer, I hope, during the course of the presentation. And then finally, work on questions of European identity, where I am the lead with a PhD student who's kind of floating around between the 4 scenes of the project. So why use the Histoire ancienne jusqu'à César? Well, the first thing that you need to know about this text is that it's a so-called universal history. And a universal history, it purports to be a history of the world from Genesis through to the present day. And the Histoire ancienne jusqu'à César is a text written in French, possibly in Flanders, but possibly in the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. There is some controversy about that, but which circulates widely throughout Europe, and I'll come back to this in a minute. There are several different redactions. The first redaction, to say Flanders and Acre, the second redaction is almost certainly composed in Naples, still in French, in the 14th century, but in a very Italianate form of French. The text is has ideas about European history and identity that run throughout it, which is another reason for choosing it. And it's largely unedited, and until very recently, almost completely neglected in the scholarship, which raises very interesting questions, I think, as to why. And one of the reasons why is that literary scholars have always regarded it as history, and historians have always regarded it as literature. So it raises very interesting questions about what counts as an object of study, what's canonical, what's not. And this is just, the slide just gives a resume of the way in which the 2 redactions differ in their narration of European history, where we have a first redaction which anchors everything in the story of Genesis and therefore in biblical history and the relationship between biblical history and ancient history. And then a second redaction which is completely dominated by the story of Troy. What you can see is that a kind of 20-folio account of Troy has been substituted with a version of the Troy story that makes up almost 3/4 of the manuscript. And I'll come back to this in just a moment. The manuscript tradition is vast, 85 manuscripts, which makes it one of the most widely disseminated texts in French of the Middle Ages, which makes it all the more surprising that it's not been edited. It is a manuscript tradition that spans 200 years, so 200 years after it was written, people continue to be interested in it, to commission copies. It's got an astonishingly wide geographical dissemination. which I will show you on a map in a minute. And our own approach is informed by actor network theory, which is to say that we're particularly interested in the role of non-human objects in the formation of networks. So not just text, but books themselves and the way in which books circulate. And this map just shows you what we know about the circulation and production of manuscripts of this text, with the blue lines representing the circulation of the first redaction, with key copies of this text produced in the Holy Land and then brought westwards. So one of the things that's very neat about this in relation to the history of French literature is that the classic French account of French literature, everything would start in Paris and move outwards. And this really is a text that moves in on France, and where, particularly with the second redaction, where we have copies of the first redaction, almost certainly, some of this is hypothetical, being brought from northern Italy southwards, then a very significant copy, which I'll show you some images of, being taken to Spain and then being taken from Spain to France, and then all other subsequent copies of that version being made from that copy and having immense cultural resonance for a whole variety of reasons. So we are trying to edit this text, but we're not producing a conventional edition. We're producing both semi-diplomatic and interpretive forms, which is to say that we are producing a straightforward transcription of the manuscript, as well as a punctuated, much more readable version of the manuscript. And the reason why we want to do this is that there are a number of reasons of this. One is that we want to make what's in the manuscript searchable in a digital way. And the main reason why we want to do this is that we're taking a different approach to the text. What traditional philology will usually seek to do is to recuperate a text that lies behind the manuscript copy, which is to say what traditional philology is trying to do is to get back to the original text. We're trying to look at the manuscript rather than through it, so we're interested in this particular manuscript version of the text, because what we're interested in is the text in time and space. So we begin and end with the manuscript, even if we do think of other dimensions of the text. I'll just tell you a little bit about the two principal manuscripts that we're working with. This is the most important manuscript of this text, which is important because it's the most extensive witness. It's important because one of the key points of interest of this text from the point of view of literary discourse is that this text was written at a point when almost everything that was written in French was written in verse. But it's written at a point when prose is beginning to emerge as a literary medium. Now, the people that have thought about prose as a literary medium in Old French have tended to focus on texts that appear a little bit after this, largely because they're more literary in nature, such as the prose Lancelot, prose Tristan, things that we recognise as part of the literary canon. But it's our belief that this text may actually be much more significant than those texts in terms of the emergence of what one could call a prose style. It's an astonishingly systematic medieval manuscript in terms of its punctuation, its segmentation of the text, and it has an astonishingly interesting trajectory. It is controversial as to where it was made, as to whether it was made in northern France, but copied from a model that was bought from the Holy Land, and one of the reasons why one might say that is to do with the style of the images, or whether it was actually made in the Holy Land. But it does appear to have been in the Eastern Mediterranean, and one of the interesting things about it is that it has annotations in Catalan, which obviously show evidence of readership by non-French readers. The second manuscript that is at the core of our project is the first manuscript, the earliest manuscript of the second redaction. Here you see a very different visual style, which is typical of Southern Italian Neapolitan manuscripts. It has a different textual organization. As I said, it's very, very focused on the Troy story. One of the interesting things about that is that it integrates into the Troy story the first translation into the vernacular of Ovid's Heroides. It doesn't mark them as translations of Ovid's Heroides. It includes them as letters that are written by the women characters during the unfurling of the story. But you can see the kind of cultural melting pot that we've got here, of these translations into French made of a Latin text in Italy, probably by Italianisms, and indeed the language is inflected by Italianisms throughout. And I've already talked a little bit about the trajectory of this particular manuscript, which goes from Naples to Spain to France, where it is copied many times over. We're producing a digital edition, and we are using TEI, which I can talk about if you like. The key point about producing a digital edition is that we make every aspect of our research open access, available to other scholars, and that also we can encode the text in a way that is responsive to the manuscript rather than to the norms of modern punctuation. So this is what our work looks like. We spend a lot of time sitting in front of computer screens that look like this, but you can see here how the encoding of the text is following the segmentation of the manuscript. This is what we actually produce, and you can see here we've already published one segment of the text, and what we will be able to do through our encoding is also align different versions of the text. But as you can see here, we're offering what we call a semi-diplomatic and interpretive. The interpretive text is punctuated as you would find in a modern book. This tries to replicate much more what's in the manuscript. And the reason why we're doing that is because of our interdisciplinary agenda, and particularly trying to work between literary scholarship, philology, and linguists. What linguists tell us is that having a digital edition that is punctuated according to modern norms is completely useless to them, because then what they're getting is something that is filtered through our idea of the way the language works. What they want is a searchable version of what's in the manuscript, and that is what we are trying to give them with our markup. So what will all this give us? It will give us an edition of this text. It also experiments in a new way of editing the text based on the manuscript rather than the text. It very importantly will give this major linguistic database, because this text is absolutely huge. And also, I haven't talked about this because I don't have time, it will have a searchable database of discursive features. For example, one of the things that we've looked at, one of the things that we're marking up, is direct and indirect discourse, and particularly the transition between direct and indirect discourse. The next theme of the project is about the nature of French in the Middle Ages, and I already talked about the relationship between what we think of as literature and the writing of history. This text is on the cusp of a number of developments in the emergence of written genres in the vernacular. One is the emergence of prose, but the other is the relationship between the text as a written text and the text as something that's intended to be read aloud. And this text is absolutely full of signals, pragmatic signals, to the fact that it's intended for oral delivery. Now, our approach to analysis of language is informed by a linguist called Suzanne Fleischmann and her idea of the text language. And the key point here is picked out in bold, about the term text language in relation to languages that that people no longer speak, and so which we have to examine through extant texts. And her key innovation was to say that we should treat these extant texts as native speakers of the language. But just to gloss this a little bit, and I'm being very crude in my characterization of traditional philology here, so please forgive me if there are any traditional philologists in the room. But you might say that the approach to the text and to the language as it's in the manuscript is always evaluated against an ideal of what the grammar of the language ought to be, and therefore deviations from it. What Fleischmann is suggesting is more that you should deduce the grammar from the text that you have in front of you, and really regard the linguistic system of the manuscript, not exactly as a closed system, because I don't think you can regard any text as a closed system, but to really work with the language of the manuscript and give the language of the manuscript credit for knowing more about itself than we do as modern scholars. And this then also responds to the agenda of recent work on Old French, such as that of Claude Buridan, which is saying we have to no longer work with editions, we must work with the manuscripts if what we want to do is to understand the language better. Now, there are many different examples that I could have given you here. One of the key things that we're working on is subordination. I just want to give you a little insight by talking about one issue, which is the relationship between verse and prose. So the Histoire ancienne is a very unusual text because although it's written in prose, it contains some quite more than 20 verse interpolations, some of which are quite lengthy, which are then written out as verse. Because in addition to these passages that are written out as verse, it's always been known that it also contains embedded verses within it that are written out as prose. In fact, one of the things that we've discovered in our work is that there are far more of them than had previously been thought. And this just gives you one example. You can read the translation where it's Qu'est-ce que l'évangile sa honte et qui Dieu remonte la croix et amante, where you can see that you've got a perfect octosyllabic rhyming couplets embedded in the prose. Let's give you another use of the same proverb here, but where the changing of the word order has been, or one of them has changed the word order, it's not clear which one, in order to create a rhyme with the way in which it's introduced, pour ce dit l'homme en proverbe. Now what you find as the text is transmitted is that couplets such as this melt increasingly into prose, so that you can see the version that you've just seen, venger sa honte, where you have a rhyme with amante. In inversion of the word order, in these manuscripts, sa honte, venger, and the rhyme disappears. So what we can see here is this movement from verse towards prose, but where the style of the prose is constantly haunted by underlying verse. And then this may affect all sorts of issues in relation to the syntax in the prose. Just one example here would be the so-called detached relative, where you can see that tells puis, you might expect the relative to be much closer to its referent in prose, and quickly in prose it becomes so. But here you have a syntactic feature in the prose which is much more characteristic of verse, but which then survives in prose as a stylistic feature because of where it comes from. Now the third theme of the project, which is to do with history and literature, I won't go through this in any detail, but the basic premise of this is that if you don't approach these texts from the point of view of modern genre categories, what you can see straight away is that there's a shared vernacular rhetoric across a whole range of different forms of writing that modern scholarship tends not to consider together. And what all of these texts share is that they're narrating stories about the distant past. So they're just different ways of writing about history. And the key thing about French in the Middle Ages, if you take that map that I showed you, the trajectory of the Histoire Ancienne, that is also a map of all the different places in which people who were not necessarily native readers of French were reading texts in French, a variety of genres. And what most of these texts share, not quite all, but what most of them share, is that they're writing about the past, and they're writing about a shared past, what I would call a European past. And part of the success of French in the Middle Ages is really to do with this shared culture in relation to the past of Europe. Now, what's all this then got to do with identity? Historically speaking, it's we're probably very familiar with Burke's saying that Europe is not so much a place as an idea. This is replicated in Robert Bartlett's very influential for medievalists, The Making of Europe. This is in stark contrast to what historians usually say, medieval historians say about Europe, is that it's not a purposeful idea. Now, if you come from a Romance philology tradition, it's very surprising to read a historian saying, oh, they weren't really interested in the idea of Europe in the Middle Ages, because one of our great foundational texts is Ernst Robert Curtius's European Literature in the Latin Middle Ages. Just to give you something from his introduction, that European literature is an intelligible unit which disappears from view when it's cut into pieces. He's a very traditional philologist, arguing in 1953, but I think he wrote it originally, it was originally published in 1953 in English, 1948 in German, arguing completely against the structures in which most of us were educated, which treat different literary traditions as separate and discrete. If I then move to some more medieval ideas, again, it's very surprising that medieval people had no idea of Europe, because actually this is the most common map of the world in the Middle Ages, the so-called TO map, because of the T and the O, where you can see that the world is represented, first of all, according to a different axis. Maps tend to put north on top only after the 15th century. It's always the east that's on top in earlier maps. The whole world is conceived of in relation to Asia, and the dimensions of this are very significant, of course, with the Mediterranean, as it is etymologically, literally, in the middle of the world. And Europe is a small part of this world, which I think is very important. It's not a Eurocentric way of thinking of the world. It's also always thought of in relation to the rest of the world. And those of you who are familiar with the Hereford Mappa Mundi will know that this is basically the same schema as the Hereford Mappa Mundi. And this is just to give you, so this is a long quotation from the Histoire Ancienne, but which is just showing you the origin of European civilization through different groups of Trojans arriving from Asia in Europe. You don't need to read it, but I've highlighted in red the reference to Europe. This is probably a very familiar quotation to some of you from Dante, where again his account of European languages is very much working on the unity of Europe and Europe as a cultural identity. And of course, one of the key things about Dante's theorization of all of this for us as people interested in this journal is that for him, of course, Romance languages are not different languages, they're different idioms within the same linguistic group, which is, of course, a key perception of Dante's De Vulgari Eloquentia. And I think that part of what I'm trying to do in this project is make a plea for a return to quite traditional philological practices and values. And again, quoting Curtius, philology is the handmaiden of the historical disciplines. And this wonderful thing that he wrote in 1948 about what we need to do is to shatter the French canon. But of course what he's arguing here is that in order to do this, we need to pay attention to language. We need to learn language, we need to understand how languages work. And I think that's something that we're rather failing to do in modern languages departments, coming under pressure to teach in English and to let students in who don't know the languages. I don't have a solution to that problem, but I do believe passionately that we have to advocate close study of language. I also would advocate trying to get money out of the ERC if you possibly can, because it is truly enabling in the way that other funding bodies are not. And it is astonishing what they will let you do. We have this marvellous seminar that meets in London 3 times a year with representative members from all over the place, and it's all paid for. One of the things that we really are succeeding in doing in this seminar in very exciting ways is getting people from different disciplines who don't normally talk to each other to speak to each other, and the collaboration in particular with colleagues in linguistics has been, I think, the most exciting development of the project. That's it. Thank you very much.